In lesson 3.1, we're going to start looking at patterns, and so our lesson objective is to find and write rules for number patterns. So when we look at every number in a pattern, each number in a pattern is called a term. And then some more vocab that we need to learn to use is a conjecture. And a conjecture would be a prediction about what may happen. So it's like a hypothesis in science, or a guess that you're making. So it's a prediction, kind of like inferencing instead of a observation. Now a sequence is a set of numbers that follow a pattern. So let's look at finding some number patterns. So when we need to look at the sequence of numbers 5, 12, 19, 26, we need to find the next two terms in this. And remember, we just don't stop at 1. We have to follow our direction. So following the next two terms. So we have to look at, well, what is the difference between 5 and 12? And not all of them are going to be as simple as saying you add or you have to subtract. But in this case, we add 7 to get to 12. So 5 plus 7 is 12, and then 12 plus 7 is 19. 19 plus 7 is 26. So each term is 7 more than the previous. So I'm going to add 7 to each one of these. So 12 plus 7 is 19. 19 plus 7 is 26. Now 26 plus 7. If I add 7 to 26, I get 33. And then I add 7 to 33, and I get 40. So I added 7 to 26 to get my fifth term, and I added 7 to 33 to get my sixth term of 40. So the fifth and sixth terms are 33 and 40. Alright, we're going to do a quick check. Here's where you check to see if you can find what our patterns are. We'll be back in a second. Go ahead and pause. Alright, so for sample A, finding what our pattern is, well, I'm going to say, well, the difference between 11 and 1 is 10. So if I add 10 to 1, I get 11. Does that same rule apply for the next set? 11 plus 10 is 21. Alright, and then if I add 10 to 21, I get 31. So my pattern is true. So if I add 10 to 31, I get 41. And if I add 10 to 41, I get 51. So our pattern was adding 10. Now for B, we have 56 and then 48. So we're going down already. We can see this. 56 plus 48. I'm sorry, it's 56 minus 48. Well, that's 8. So let's see if that same rule applies. So 48 minus 8, I get 40. That's true. 40 minus 8, I get 32. That's true. So let's keep our rule happening where I subtract 8 from 32, and I get 24. And then I subtract 8 from 24, and I get 16. Alright, and for C, I have 29. And I go to 36, so I'm increasing each time. So 29 plus 29 and 36, the difference between that. So if I wanted to, I could say 36 minus 29. And I'm going to get 7. So if I subtract 7, add 7, add 7, I get 36. Add 7, I get 43. That's true. Add 7, I get 50. So it must be that I have to add 7. So 50 plus 7 is 57, and then 57 plus 7, I get 64. Alright, let's go on and check our next set. Alright, using a rule to write a pattern. So now we need to actually write out a rule. And there's a key phrasing that we need to apply here. If we look at this example, write the first 6 terms in a number pattern described by this rule. So the rule is start with 47 and subtract 3 repeatedly. So that's going to be our model that we're going to follow. So I'm starting at 47 and I'm going to subtract 3. So if I subtract 3 from 47, I get 44. So I'm going to repeatedly subtract 3 from that point. So 44 minus 3, I get 41. And I'm going to subtract 3, and I get 38. And I'm going to subtract 3, and I get 35. And I subtract 3, and I get 32. So I'm subtracting 3 from each term to find the next. But it is important to look at that we have to write our rules just like this. Obviously changing what our starting number and what our operation and that operation's change is going to be. So for our third example, write a rule to describe the pattern 2.3, then 4.4, then 6.5, then 8.6. Now we need to follow the pattern, and they already gave us what our repeatedly operation is by adding 2.1 each. So if I add 2.1 to 8.6, then I get 10.7. If I add 2.1 to 10.7, I get 12.8. And then I add 2.1 to 12.8, I get 14.9. So to get from one term to the next, I'm going to add 2 1/10, or 2.1. So the rule, I know that I'm going to add 2.1 repeatedly, but remember that the previous example where we have to start off with something, the previous one it said start with 47. Well, what am I starting with here? Well, I'm starting with S. There we go. Start with 2.3, because that's what we're starting with, 2.3, and add 2.1 repeatedly. So that would be our rule, is we start with 2.3 and add 2.1 repeatedly. Alright, now we're going to pause, and you're going to do the quick check, and we'll check here in a bit. Alright, so if we go from quick check for 2a, I'm going to subtract 15 repeatedly. So if I take 90 minus 15, 90 minus 15, I'm going to get 75. And then I'm going to subtract 15 from 75, and I'm going to get 60. And I'm going to subtract 15 from 60, and I get 45. I'm going to subtract 15 from 45, and I get 30. Comma between those. And I need to go find the first 6 terms. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I do one more. So I subtract 15 from 30, and I get 15. Alright, now for B, I have 1. I start with 1, and I need to multiply by 3 repeatedly. So start with 1, and then I multiply by 3. And I have a faculty meeting here coming up soon. But start with 1, I multiply by 3, and I get 3. Then I multiply by 3, and I get 9. Make that look like a 9, there we go. And I'm going to multiply by 3, and I'm going to get 27. And then I'm going to multiply by 3. So 27 times 3, and I get 81. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I do this one more time. 81 times 3, and I get 243. So our first 6 terms, following the rule, start with 1, multiply by 3, would be 1, 3, 9, 27, 81, 243. Alright, now the next two, a little bit tougher. Cranking it up a notch, we start with 1.5, and then our next one is 4.5. So I could say, well, I'm going to add 3. But if I add 3 to 4.5, 13.5 is not 7.5. So I need to find out what is our rule that we need to follow. So I guess the idea is I'm going to start with, cross our T, start with 1.5. And what? So I need to figure out what is the sequence I need to, or what's the operation I need to follow? Well, if I take 1.5 and I multiply it by 3, 1.5 times 3, well, that's going to give me, well, 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times 1 is 3, plus 1 is 4. I have one digit to the right of the decimal in my problem, so my next digit's 4.5. Ooh, I'm on something here. So 4.5 times 3, so I do the same thing. 3 times 5 is 15, carry the 1. 3 times 4 is 12, plus 1 is 13. Did I follow the next number? Yep, 13.5. So I do the same thing, times 3, 13.5, and I get my 40.5. 3 times 5 is 15, carry my 1. 3 times 3 times 3 is 9, and I get 10 after I add that 1. I carry my 1, and I get 3 times 1 is 3, plus 1 is 4, 40.5. Now, 40.5 times 3 is going to be 121.5. Make that look like a 2. 121.5, and then 121.5 times 3 is going to be 364.5. And then 364.5 times 3 is going to be 1093.5. So those would be my next 3 terms. So my rule would be start with 1.5 and multiply by 3. Alright, now for B. 265, and then I go to 128, and then I go to 64. Well, I know I'm going to start. Make that look like a W. There you go. Start with 256. And what? Now I need to follow some kind of rule or some kind of step. Well, 256 and 128. Well, that's, if I subtract 128, I get 128. But if I subtract 128 from 120, I'm going to get 0. So that doesn't work to get to 64. But if I look at what I just did there, is I divided 156 by 2 to get 128. And then 128 divided by 2 is 64. So if I divide 64 by 2, I get 32. And if I divide 32 by 2, then I get 16. And I divide by 2 again, and I get 8. So start with 256 and divide by 2. So my next 3 digits, or my next 3 numbers, would be 32, 16, and 8. That concludes lesson 3.1.